Alright. That is like washing me out, all kinds of stuff. I may have to do some camera adjustment, but it's actually cutting off the top of my head. Not a fan. Yeah, this is a different camera. I am trying it out because the other camera decided it didn't want to play. So lighting's a bit different because it's a different camera. So, alright, but we are back for the moment. Alright. I do apologize for the tech issues. It's been something that I've been dealing with for the last week or so. So it's just kind of, it's a thing right now. Alrighty. Let's see. I'm gonna back up a few lines here. There was a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back from the ledge. Mick! Callista cried in shock. What are you doing? Micron quickly came back to himself and looked back at the ledge before smiling at Callista. I'm just getting lost in my thoughts. The rogue smiled. And testing your reflexes. My reflexes? Callista gasped, sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breath was visible in the cool morning air. She had only just reached the plateau upon which Mick stood. Mick, if you had fallen. Callie. Mick cut her off with a laugh. My being on the council doesn't mean you have to call me master all the time. And if I had fallen, I would have caught myself. Turns out, I didn't need to. You knew I was here? She arched an eyebrow. You sensed me coming? The rogue nodded as he walked toward the center of the large plateau. He wore his black and gray Jedi tunic and pants, which were much warmer than his regular clothes, and his cloak whipped in the wind. But I had shut down my presence, she said, confused. She, too, wore traditional Jedi attire, hers in various shades of tan and teal. She had tied her hair back in a ponytail, and her blue eyes searched the rogue's face. But how? That's a lesson for another day, Micron replied with a wink. Today, we're fighting. Understand today, and you'll be closer to your answer for the rest. The rogue found a suitable rock and took off his cloak and set the small stone on top to keep it from blowing off the cliff with the wind. He turned to Callista and unclipped his lightsaber from his belt. He then found her staring at him with open amusement. You've been spending too much time with Master Card, she said. You're starting to speak in riddles like he does. He just shrugged. Or maybe I'm just getting you flustered. You never know. What? Callista started to ask. Her question died in a gasp as Mick appeared beside her, his lightsaber lit and held to her throat. She hadn't even seen him move. 1 second, he was 10 meters away. The next, he stood less than an inch from her side. His left hand had her wrist, and his right had his blade held reversed and positioned just below her chin. He shut down the blade, let it go of her wrist, and backed away. The first lesson, he said. If you can distract your opponent, do it, but don't get distracted yourself. I wasn't exactly ready. Callista had both her blades in hand now, and she shrugged her cloak off, letting the wind take it. And... Point taken, she said, as she ignited her sabers and assumed an on-guard position. Her short blade was forward in her left hand, horizontal in front of her. Her long blade in her right she kept pointed at the rogue. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her center low, and her profile to her opponent. She'd not be taken off guard again. Mick grinned. His silver blade sprang to life once more, and he stalked towards her. Her breath caught at the electricity she saw dancing in his eyes. He was on her again in a heartbeat, his blade flashing left and right so fast she could only barely keep up, operating entirely on the defensive. Each blow landed like a hammer, and his targeting kept her blades moving constantly to pick up each attack. Barely 10 seconds had passed, and she could feel her arms tiring already. Left, right, Left, right, left, right. It was a pattern. She blocked left and low with her shoto, then moved to block high and right with the same blade while she swept her long blade through the air towards the rogue's neck. But the high right blow never came, and the rogue was ducking her shot before she swung. Both blades were on her right for the barest of moments, but she knew in the instant that she was criffed. The initial impact was soft, somehow, and yet the force of it lifted her off her feet and flung her toward the rock wall 30 meters back, faster than a blaster bolt. She squeezed her eyes shut against the impact, but it never came. Finally, she opened them to find herself a hair's breadth from the wall and floating gently down towards the ground. Mick's outstretched hand traced her movements until her feet found purchase on the stone. Lesson 2, he said. Though the distance between them was great and the wind howled, he seemed to be whispering right in her ear. Don't follow your opponent's rhythm. Break it. Criff with the timing of the fight. Disrupt the flow and off-balance your opponent, and don't be afraid to use whatever you have. In a friendly duel, you can follow the rules, fight honorably, whatever. But in a real fight, you do whatever you have to. You win. She only nodded and set her feet. He, still 30 meters away, assumed an easy Form 3 stance. She charged. Using the force to enhance her speed, she crossed the distance in mere moments. Reaching the rogue, she lashed out with everything she had. She varied her attacks, gave him patterns, then broke them, stuttered her timing, and he continued, picking up every strike. Callista feinted high right with her long blade and thrust towards Mick's middle with her shoto. The conduit pivoted on his right foot, Callista's thrust sailing in front of his midsection. Her long blade continued its arc toward his neck, but he blocked the blade with his own, held in his left hand, while he grabbed her extended left wrist with his own right. His hand enveloped hers in a three-quarter turn that nearly brought her shoto into her chest. She dropped the hilt, and the blade disappeared. Still, the rogue kept his hold and stepped into her. She dropped to her back, trying to roll with the joint lock. She managed a backward somersault and came to her feet, but he still had her wrist. She pulled and lashed out with her long blade simultaneously, but he caught that as well. Suddenly, however, none of that mattered as she found herself hanging several thousand feet over the edge of a cliff. She looked to see him holding her out over the edge with his right hand firmly around her left wrist. His brown hair had grown out a bit longer in the front. Still naturally rakish, it fluttered lightly in the wind. The ordeal he and Ari had gone through had granted the rogue a second chance at life. His face was smooth and hard except for the scar along his left cheek and the ever-present stubble. But his eyes, his deep brown eyes, betrayed the decades of experience his true age bestowed. The knowledge of nearly 100 years of fighting and training shone in the depths of his eyes as he stared down into hers. Lesson 3. He winked at her. Everything is your weapon to use, especially the environment. You need to focus on your opponent, but not to the extent that you no longer sense your surroundings. Callista stretched her senses as he spoke and immediately found what she was looking for. In the heat of the fight, her awareness had sharpened. It was as though the force flowed more freely through her while she fought the rogue. She found the hilt of her shoto in her mind's eye and called it to her hand. It flew towards the back of Mick's head, and he ducked it, letting go of Callista's wrist. Her stomach flew into her throat as gravity took her. She dropped like a stone, her shoto flying into her left hand as she fell. Using the force, she nudged herself towards the rock wall and a small ledge just 5 meters down. Landing in a crouch, she gathered yet more force energy into herself and sprang upward. She could sense where Mikron was, and as she crested the lip of the ledge, she lashed out with both blades. The conduit backpedaled as he blocked both strikes. A wide smile played across his face as Callista continued her assault. She gained ground on the rogue with every attack, forcing him back on the defensive. A slight grin tugged at the corner of her mouth when she saw the first signs of sweat break out on his forehead. Her own robes and hair were nearly soaked through with sweat already, but she didn't care. Mikron was sweating. She'd made him break a sweat. In a heartbeat, however, her elation was replaced with a shock and a small amount of pain. The rogue somehow had tied up both of her blades in one block and rammed his left shoulder into her chest. Her hands flew out to her sides in an attempt to break her fall, and her blades clattered across the stone ground. Lesson 4. The rogue stood over her with the tip of his blade hovering just over her chest. You haven't won until you've won. He extinguished his blade and stepped back a few paces. She rolled to her feet and called both of her hilts back to her hands. Cautiously, she observed the conduit. Her senses peaked. She could almost see the force flowing into and through him. When she tried to find him within the stream, he vanished completely, melding into the force and hiding within the very current itself. She could not read him, so she was forced to rely on her physical senses to track his movements, a problem when he had already displayed the ability to move faster than human eyes could track. But he wasn't moving now. He observed her casually, and she could feel his subtle touch within the force. "The final lesson for today," he said. Again, it was as if his voice were inside her mind. "You have to let go. You've been trained well. Trust the training. Trust your body to know the movements. Trust your blades to know their attacks. Trust your instincts to read the fight. Make your mind a blank slate. Nothing exists but the fight. Don't condense your world. Instead, expand it. Try to forget yourself and flow along with the river of the force. Don't try to direct it. Don't put your preconceived notions on top of it." "It seems like you're contradicting yourself, Mick." Callista cast the rogue an exasperated look. "Focus on the fight, but expand my awareness?" "You'll see," the rogue said, igniting his silver blade again. "Let go." He was on her in an instant, his eyes flashing with electricity and his blade becoming a nearly solid path of ardent light. Callista barely had time to think. Mick pushed and pushed hard. His attacks came in fast and varied, forcing her to act on instinct and trust in the force. Her hands moved of their own volition, her feet and body flowing, dodging, ducking, advancing. It was an unfamiliar and exhilarating experience. It was almost as though she was observing herself from outside her body. She saw openings in Mick's defense, and her blades leaped up to take advantage of them on their own. The feeling was fleeting, though. Her elation brought her out of the flow. Her blades were suddenly swinging through open air, and Mick was nowhere to be seen. Her feet were swept from beneath her by Mick's low kick, and she found herself on her back once more. She sighed, looking up at the rogue, her blades lying dormant at her side. She feared his disappointment, but was surprised by the huge smile spreading across his face. He extinguished his blade and clipped the hilt back onto his belt before reaching down to help her to her feet. "That was excellent, Callie," he said, beaming. "Excellent?" She rubbed her back and knew she'd be hurting for most of the day after this. "I think I may have been able to let go for all of a second." "I know," he replied, smiling broadly as he called his cloak back to himself and used it to wipe away the barest hint of sweat from his forehead. "You did incredibly well. You're not teasing me, are you?" Callista arched an eyebrow as she called her own cloak to herself. She had sweat dripping into her eyes, so she used the hem of the cloak to wipe some of it away. She'd need a shower when they returned to the Card's estate from the mountain. "Not at all." Macron shook his head as they made their way to the narrow mountain path that led back to the massive clearing in the stone. "You're a quick study, which seems to have paid off. Keep what I've taught you here in your heart and you'll do well." She nodded her thanks. She was still quite out of breath, and the mountain path was not easy. "Hell," the rogue continued, "find me again sometime. We'll practice more. It feels good to teach." "Oh?" Callista smirked. "My body is telling me that learning feels like pain." Mick just shrugged. "It's the best instructor I ever had." Mick had just left to start his trek up the mountain. The sun had not yet risen, and Ari was sliding her boots on over a pair of black, slim-fitting utility pants. Extra layers of durable fabric were sewn into the knees and other key areas. She wore a brilliant blue tunic, a shade darker than her icy blue eyes, and her hair was pulled back into a ponytail. She'd wrapped her wrist and her hands in black athletic tape. She stood from the bed and strapped on her gun belt. In its holster was a new DT-12, modified for better accuracy and slimmed down to fit her hand. On the opposite side hung her lightsaber. Quietly, she slipped out of the guest house. Stretching in the darkness before dawn, relishing the hint of pine floating on the cool morning air, she mentally prepared for what was to come. Zan really wanted that fight. Though his original intentions irked her, she could see that the Mando still had more than his share of steam to burn off. Maybe the sparring match would be good for him. Maybe her son-in-law could actually try to relax afterward. Ari shook her head and rolled her shoulders a bit, working out the last vestiges of sleep. They'd picked a clearing in the woods just south of the Card estate. She knew the spot. Years ago, her husband had fought and killed a Katani guildsman there. The claymore he'd planted still stood at the head of an exceptionally green mound of grass. Zan didn't know that, of course. Even Ari hadn't known about that particular incident until well after the fact, but those had been different times. She took off at a brisk jog across the grass and towards the path into the woods. As she ran, she began to let herself fall into the force. Within herself, she could feel the phoenix stirring. "Hey, Taba!" The battle was imminent, and the fiery bird was stretching its wings and flexing its talons in excited anticipation. Ari reined it in a bit, and the fire behind her icy blue eyes cooled. Not yet, Ari thought to herself. She knew Zan would be a formidable opponent, but she didn't want to bring the full brunt of the phoenix to bear on him. He was, after all, her son-in-law. It wouldn't do to come back without anything but a charred helmet for Callista. Though the sun had finally crested the horizon, the clearing was still mostly dark when Ari arrived. The trees lining the edges kept the circle in the cool morning darkness just a few minutes longer. She walked to where the claymore stood, planted firmly in the ground, and rested a hand upon the pommel. The metal was cool to the touch, but as she slid her hand down onto the grip, she could almost feel the warmth and strength of her husband's hands. "What's with the ancient blade?" a gruff voice said from behind her. Ari turned to see Zan entering the clearing from the opposite direction. The Mandalorian was in full Beskar gab. His voice, while gruff, was tinged with the electronic sound of his helmet's comm system. Two rippers sat on his hips, holstered in what looked like extensions of his leg plates. His black and red armor shone in the early morning light like he'd cleaned it just that morning. Ari arched an eyebrow, shrugged, and regarded Zan easily. "Just a memento from not as long ago as you'd think," she said, unclipping her lightsaber from her belt. "You ready for this?" "More than you know, probably," Zan replied, reaching behind his back and drawing his own hilt. A feral grin spread across Ari's face, and the phoenix eagerly flexed its talons. Her blade sprang to life, its hue the same as her eyes. The light from the weapon in the early morning cast her features in cold determination. The sounds of the woods died away suddenly, and all Catan seemed to be holding its breath. For an eternity, it seemed, the two stood 15 meters apart. Outside their clearing, a twig snapped beneath the weight of a small woodland rodent, and Ari sprang into action with a crack like the lightning. She crossed the distance in a heartbeat, aiming for a cut that would split Zan from left hip to right shoulder if she hadn't dialed her blade down to the lowest setting. As it was, if she connected, the Manda would be bruised, but alive. Zan quickly ignited his own saber and barely had enough time to get it in front of Ari's upward swing. The force of the blow shocked him, not taking him off his feet, but staggering him back a few places. How she generated such power from such a small frame was beyond him, but he had little time to ponder the anomaly. Ari's attacks came in with dizzying speed and ferocity. Her form wasn't as flashy or artistic as some, but her technique was perfect. Zan blocked high and outside with his blade held in his right hand while he swept his left in a vicious back fist through the air where Ari's head had been not a moment before. She ducked under his arm and came up on his right side. The Mandalorian snaked a booted foot between her legs and slammed his right shoulder into Ari's chest. Almost before it landed, she fell back with the blow, and as her body fell, her right boot came up and caught Zan below the chin. The force of her kick finally lifted him off his feet. His shoulders hit first, and he allowed momentum to carry him into a backward roll. He came up on his feet with his blade held in a defensive position across his chest. He nodded vigorously to readjust his helmet as it had slid up a bit with the impact. Ari had regained her footing and charged in on him once more. Zan knew he'd have to pull out all the stops in this fight, and the smile behind his helmet stretched nearly from ear to ear. She was a warrior, more like him than he could have guessed. She and the rogue both presented a calm front to the galaxy, but they reveled in combat beneath it. He'd found a worthy opponent, one he could truly test himself against. He wouldn't waste the opportunity. Sorry, turning the music down just a smidge. Okay. Okay. What did we do with Evelina, Rogue? Ari asked as she helped Micron load the last of their luggage onto the Firebird for the return trip home. I know Jade would take good care of her, but with Zan's vision, I'm not sure Catan will remain the safest place in the galaxy for long. I don't think anywhere is going to remain safe for long, Princess. Mick shrugged as he strapped on the last of their luggage. He then turned to find Ari leaning against the curved wall of the corridor aboard the Firebird. She cast the rogue a look. You're not helping, she said, arms crossed. Her long auburn hair hung freely past her shoulders and down her back. Her icy blue eyes gazed softly at her husband. She wore a slim, fitting blue tunic with a plunging neckline and black trousers that hugged her legs. Black nerf-hide boots rode up to mid-calf, her tiki blade tucked neatly in a sheath in the left boot. Her lightsaber hung on her gun belt opposite a newer Model DL. I know, Mick said, crossing to her and kissing her lightly on the cheek. He headed down the corridor towards the boarding ramp with Ari following. Maybe we take her with us everywhere. The kid's got a gift for hearing what people don't want to be heard. Maybe she could actually help us read Maxwell, find out what he's hiding. Micron, Ari admonished the rogue. If he's thinking what I think you think he's thinking, I don't want Evelina to hear any of it. You think? Mick arched an eyebrow at his wife. Ari punched him in the shoulder and shoved him toward the path from the landing pad to the card estate. I'm trying to be serious here, laser brains. Sorry, Your Highness. Mick raised both hands in defense. I don't have a good answer for you. In my opinion, we keep her close. I know I'd feel better knowing she was always with either you or me. That much I can agree on, Ari said as they neared the wraparound port to the card's main house. Evelina could just be seen through the den window, hugging her stuffed tauntaun as she watched a new holovid with the other kids. But I don't want her anywhere near Maxwell. I was just joking, sweetheart, Mick said, leaning back against the railing. Poor kid's gonna be upset we can't stay longer. Yeah, Ari sighed, leaning into Mick's embrace. Which one of us gets the joyful job of telling her? Mick reached into his pocket and fished out a cred chip. Flippy for it? You're on, Ari winked. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes. And I'm going to pause here and take a stretch. And just take a drink of water. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Mick had lost the coin toss. He chuckled again over his wife's blatant use of the Force to alter the outcome. He sat in the pilot's chair aboard the Firebird and gazed out at the mottled sky of hyperspace. They had said their goodbyes only an hour before, and Evelina was already fast asleep in her bed in the captain's quarters. The tiny vibrations of the ship as it flew through hyperspace soothed her as it did her father. Mick smiled. Hurtling through space towards yet another galactic crisis, the Conduit, the Phoenix, and their daughter were surprisingly content. We've got each other, Ari said, reading the rogue's thoughts from the co-pilot seat. As long as that's true, I'm happy. Me too, Princess. Me too. Alright, and that is the end of this chapter 15. And I'm gonna see how far we can go. Okay. Here we go. Chapter 16. The Praxium. The morning following the council meeting. The horse was slow going up the hill. Jared couldn't really blame him, for it had been a long ride from Kingston. The shuttle he had chartered from his home was unfamiliar with the system, and Jared was fine with landing at Kingston. He saw one of the stables outside the port city, and was provided with a mount that he'd come to enjoy thoroughly. He'd taken great care of the horse on the night he had to rest before finishing the trip to Edmonton. He could have taken a speeder, but he was more used to horseback from all his time at home and at the Praxium. He'd been a Jedi Knight for only a few years, and wore the traditional brown robes, tabards, and trousers, but with a gray tunic. He felt better when he walked his mount through the main gates of the Praxium and dismounted, rubbing the horse's neck and whispering thanks to him as he started to walk him towards the old monastery stables. Marin was coming out of the stairwell to the dormitory, a small pack over her shoulder. She wore plain clothes in place of her usual tunics. Her saber hung from her belt, but her twin DE-10s were absent. They were stowed in her pack for now. She'd opted for her knives instead, not knowing the situation they'd end up in once they'd reached the ship at Kingstonport. She knew the delegates meant no harm, but what of the other colonists? That thought nagged at her as she started across the courtyard to meet Zan and Ethan at the cart estate. Jared walked the horse into the stall, started to undo the saddle, and draped it over the door to the stall when he spotted Marin walking across the courtyard with her pack. "Going somewhere?" he called out, catching her attention. He'd not had a chance to let anyone know he was on his way back. Marin whirled, a grin blossoming across her face. She hadn't seen him in months. He'd been off on this or that mission with barely any time to rest. "Jared!" She was across the courtyard before his name had fully left her lips, her pack slipping to the paving stones as she buried her face in his chest. She was silent a moment before she answered the question. "Alec, I'm meeting Ethan. We're going to Kingstonport before we head out for my Verdgoten." "Really?" he asked as he laughed from the sudden rush and hug. "I just came from there, as a matter of fact." He grinned, finishing putting up all the tack gear from the horse, and rubbed the horse down. "So, your trial, eh? I only ask one thing, Marika." His use of her familiar name caused her to stop and look up at him. "Alec, Jerica?" she asked softly as she leaned up against the stall gate. He smiled, kissed her softly, and then returned to rubbing the horse down. "Come back safely." She clung to his hand momentarily before he started rubbing the horse down again. "I'll do my best." She was silent for a moment. I'm going to check out some of the colonists from the Telos system. I spoke with the delegates the day before yesterday and felt no malice from them. But Etika's convinced something's up. So we're going to have a look around the ship that's moored at Kingston. She chewed briefly on her lower lip. They want to settle on the Tanagas moon. I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting in about 5 seconds. So, have a minute and a half. It's a great time to go get a snack, get a drink, and I will be right back, actually, because I'm going to do just that. And we're back. Alrighty. Turn that down just a little bit more. That got Jared's attention, and he nodded as he thought about what she'd told him. Ethan has a lot of experience, and I suppose that nothing can be left to chance with Deathwatch or anyone else right now. He finished up with the horse and gave him a handful of oats as thanks for the journey. Then he closed the stall door after she walked through, and I know that I can't come along on this. She frowned. Zynika's given me my Vergoten. I'm to find a way to take care of the Kirtsod incursions into Katani space. For good. She leaned on his shoulder. I know. I can't help feeling that this might be one of the hardest things I've ever done. Kirtsod doesn't give up easily. Neither do you. Sorry. Jared reminded her. You've certainly proved that when Ethan tested you. How is the old sand panther anyway? She grinned. A bit worse for wear, but he's all right. Apparently one of his last missions for Zan didn't end as he thought it would. She shrugged and tucked a few loose strands of hair behind her left ear. How long are you here? I don't know, he told her. Master Card asked me to report how things have settled on my home after the task that Rhaenys and I undertook there. After that, I don't know if I will be given another assignment or if I will have time to rest. I've been hearing rumors of a lot happening while I was gone. She nodded. According to Zan, besides the Kirtsod, the Blackhawks are off on patrol. The pirate activity has been rampant lately, even here. She wasn't sure how much she could tell him. Well, I'm sure to be told what I need to know, he said, with a smile as he walked over to pick up her pack from the paving stones. I know you'll be gone for a time, but how soon do you have to be gone for Kingston? I was to meet Ethan at 0900. It's currently 0800. It won't take me long to reach the cards either, so I have some time. She eyed him for a moment. What did you have in mind? She asked with a half smile. Just some time together, Jared said as he traced her cheek. I'll walk with you. I can report to the master there. Marin nodded, not protesting when he took up her pack. It wasn't heavy. She slipped her fingers into his as they turned towards the Praxium gates. I'm glad that you're back safe. As am I, he said as they walked through the gates together. Things have settled down quite a bit at home, thankfully, but I saw quite a bit of movement when my shuttle entered the system. She frowned. What do you mean? He looked up to the sky for a moment as they walked. The entire fleet's deploying, it looks like. Marin nodded. Lek, there's been several attempts to breach our borders, and not just by Kirtsod. She sighed and rubbed the back of her neck. I hoped to get some of the Blackhawks to help with Kirtsod, but they've already shipped out. I don't know what else is going on. Master Card or Zan could tell you more than I could. He nodded. How were your studies with Andrea while I've been away? It's been interesting. Andrea's been handling many more diplomatic duties, some of which I've gotten to help with. I'm starting to settle in and get my saber forms down. I'm finding myself more suited for Shien, actually. She smiled a little. I've also been working with Ethan on the more Mandoad skills. Been able to consistently hit your knives on the center target when you practice throwing? He asked. He had noticed them on her belt, along with her saber. That got her to grin. Alec, I have. She glanced down for a second. I have my DE-10s, but I've also got a few smaller weapons, including a holdout blaster and knives. I wanted to be prepared for tight quarters in case something happens. Give me just a second, guys. There we go. Ah, sound effects, why? There we go. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that wasn't really jiving with what, working with what I, needed. So, alright. Aye, he said, as he hefted her pack. I thought the D10s were heavier than this, but I guess I was wrong. She smirked a little. They aren't cumbersome, if that's what you mean. I just don't know. Than set this as my Verdgoten. It seems like a lot. I won't be alone, though. Something like this, I hoped he wouldn't. But then again, Master Zan tends to surprise all of us. She grinned. Alec, he's good for that, at least. Aye, he said with a smile of his own as they rounded the corner in the trail. She shrugged and smiled, looking up as they approached the bend in the trail. The cards estate spread out before them, the sun just beginning to climb higher in the sky. Catan, Kingston Port. She should be here in just a little while, he heard as he moved down the corridor. She wanted to show us the limits of what we agreed to. She's coming on board with a friend of hers, the other said. I think it's her guardian, but you can never be sure unless it's told to you. So, they were going to have company. He kept moving down the corridor of the transport to the quarters he shared with his fellow member of Kurtzad. There may be a problem, he said, ensuring the door was locked behind him before he spoke. What kind of problem? The other asked as he looked out the viewport to the spaceport below. The girl they had to negotiate with to settle on the moon is coming with another to travel with us to the site. Maybe it won't be as much of a problem as you're thinking. I'd probably say to keep your senses open the whole time we're on this tub, Ethan said as they stepped off the air shuttle that brought them to the Kingston spaceport. Marin nodded and looked over at Ethan as she readjusted her weapons belt. She wore a plain tunic and had braided her hair down her back. Her fingers brushed her DE-10s. She decided to wear them on her belt, but kept her knives handy. She couldn't shake a nagging feeling that pulled at the back of her mind. Ever since Ethan had voiced his concern, she'd been extra watchful. Ethan wore simple attire and had his blaster on his right hip with a vibroblade in its sheath on the left. He kept his extra weapons hidden. Even if there's one or two of those scumbags on board, they have enough time to study what they can of the system layout. I don't like it. Hey, Coffee Crystals, how you doing? I'm gonna turn my stuff down here one sec. Okay. Me either, Marin said softly as she studied the lines of the old freighter. It was an older freighter. She could see the peeling paint and the scratch marks from blaster bolts. We know the delegates. I don't think any of them are Kurtzad. Maybe some of the colonists. She frowned and took mental stock of the weapons she had with her. Her twin DE-10s, as well as her saber, were visible, but she had hidden her knives in her tunic. We should have plenty of time to check everyone out, he said as he looked over the ship. This rust bucket probably can't be fast in hyperspace. We're glad to have you with us, the one in charge of the expedition said from the top of the boarding ramp. We were preparing to leave within the hour. And this is? He asked as he gestured to Ethan. Marin glanced sideways at Ethan for a moment as she pondered. This is Ethan, my guardian, she said, not elaborating. She didn't provide a last name. Good to meet you, Ethan said kindly enough as he hefted his pack and started to walk with her up the boarding ramp. Marin told me what was happening, and I thought I'd check it out, too. She smiled as she realized the hidden meaning in Ethan's words. She nodded at Aaron standing at the top of the ramp as she followed Ethan through the hatch. If she remembered correctly, his name was Aaron. She felt him slip around Ethan and lead the way down the somewhat cramped corridor, talking as they went. Once they were settled, Ethan set his pack down and looked over at Marin. Well, he told her, they're not from Telos, but from the accent and dress, they're from the same system. With a sigh, Marin sank down beside him on the bunk and leaned against the bulkhead. She held up her hand briefly and closed her eyes, scanning for listening devices in the Force. She found one. Reaching out, She pulled it off the bulkhead and dropped it to the deck, smashing it with her boot. Now then, she said, after a moment's silence. Why would they lie to us about that? As far as I know, neither the Katani nor the Republic has quarrels with anyone from the Telos system. As I said, they're probably from the same system, he told her as he checked over his blaster. I've been there before, and they have a few habitable planets. These may be a bunch from one of the other outer planets. We'll be able to find out eventually. She nodded and checked the charge on her DE-10s. Both full. The lightsaber Andrea had given her rode her left hip, and she brushed it with her fingertips. Sovereign's lightsaber. She sighed. Perhaps one day she'd get to build one of her own. But for now, they had a mission. Her lips quirked. Well, we can't exactly go around asking questions. They'd get suspicious. It's a good bet if Kirat Saad is on board, they know we're here. They know we're here? Probably, he said as he pulled out a portable datapad and started to enter a few commands and look through the results. But if they know who we are, is another question. She raised an eyebrow and peeked over her shoulder to watch for a moment. I know Duran was able to keep tabs on Buir, but something tells me this isn't Duran. I almost get the feeling he assigned a few of his men. If the delegates knew who I was, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for the Kirat Saad to find out as well. She frowned. You've managed to stay off the radar well enough, so I don't think they know who you are. And that's a nice thing when I don't want to know... That's a nice thing when those I don't want to know who I am either don't find out, or... He merely shrugged. Well, I haven't taken innocent blood yet. There, I've got their previous flight path. She grinned and leaned over her shoulder. This freighter's been around a bit. Telos. She frowned as she read the next entry. What would they have stopped on Dak for? Did they say where all they had explored? He asked as he looked over the charts. Just the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere is too rocky and mountainous for their needs. She grinned a little. Though, I'm wondering what kind of defenses Buir put on the house. He never actually told me. I almost want someone to try so I can find out. Not how I'd want to check it right now, Ethan said as he looked through the flight records. Well, everything on this side of things checks out. I guess we get to see how well your perception skills are. Marin smiled a bit nervously. Alec, it should be enlightening. She took a few slow breaths to center herself. I'm ready as I'll ever be. Let's find us some Kirat Saad. How much time do you need to meditate and search through everyone? She thought about it. There are only about 50 colonists, so it shouldn't take long. She sat down once more. Did you, by chance, get a schematic? She asked, pointing to his datapad with her chin. Ethan grinned and pulled it up for her on the screen. I'm not a great slicer, but Andrea and one of the others on the High Council were able to set up this datapad for me. Marin took the datapad from him with a grin and a shake of her head. You might as well sit back down while I do this. It might take a bit. She fiddled with the controls until she had a passenger manifest alongside the schematic. With a little more fiddling, she got the list to overlay on the schematic, showing which cabin each passenger was assigned to. That's why I come prepared, he said as he pulled a stone from his pack and another blade to start sharpening. She just grinned at him and balanced the pad on her knees as she closed her eyes. Her finger drifted down the passenger list slowly as she focused on each passenger one at a time. Most of them had the same feeling Erin did, the desire to start anew, but she couldn't get a good read on 2 of them. The names were odd as well. A frown creased her forehead as her finger stopped on the first of the 2. Ramkota. That was most definitely not a Telosian name. Her finger slid down the list more. All felt normal until she hit another odd name. Dar Werda. She knew what that meant. No longer in the shadows. That was not very original for one who was trying to hide. She got the same odd feeling. Elusive, as if the 2 knew how to shield themselves, but not well. Her eyes fluttered open and she looked down at the schematic. The two shared a cabin 1 deck down from her current location, cabin 121C. She looked at Ethan. I think we got him. She pointed out the 2 names on the passenger manifest. Ethan finished honing the edge of his knife and looked over the list himself. When should we go after them? Marin frowned. I'd say now, but we wouldn't have anywhere to stash them. We're in hyperspace, and I don't want to start a firefight on the ship if we can avoid it. She set the pad down on the bunk and scrubbed her face with her hands, but we do need to corner them and deal with them soon. We have no way of knowing if they're armed, Marika, he told her as she sheathed his knife and checked his blaster again. And as you said, there is pretty tight quarters for a firefight, so what do you think? If we wait till we get dirt side, it would give us more room to maneuver. I think once we get past the laying of ground rules out of the way with the colonists, she frowned and sighed. Part of her wanted to get it over with now, but she knew that would put the safety of the other colonists at risk. Well, we do have one thing working for us if we go dirt side, Ethan said as he checked a few of his other weapons. She grinned a little. We know the terrain better than anyone. We should, he answered with a grin as he closed his pack. And we'll have some backup once we get there. We will? She asked, a note of curiosity in her voice as she sensed the closure on her small pack as well. She carried a change of clothes, water, rations, and a few other weapons and spare power packs for the DE-10s in case they were needed. He grinned and gave her a sideways hug. I called in a few favors. Taylon's unit is already there under camo. That got her to smile. Thank you for the follow!
Femdizzy is now following.
That got her to smile. We could certainly use the help. There's no telling what those two have with them anyway. And I imagine Jarius's old unit would love to be in on this. Her smile turned slightly predatory for a moment. Alec, I imagine they would, she said softly. She glanced at the chrono readout on the datapad. We're getting close. Then let's do it. Tanagus 5. Things had settled in nicely at first. Marin had shown the group most of the lower half of the moon as they flew overhead to a clearing they had picked out for their landing site. After ensuring everything was secured, she walked with them around the area to study the terrain and how they would best use the resources there. They were returning to the ship when she looked across and saw Ethan standing there waiting for them. He was dressed in civilian utility pants, boots, and a light shirt for the warm air, and his equipment pack was over his shoulder. They've headed out, he told Marin as he looked over the others. Who has headed out? Aaron, the expedition leader, asked as he looked around. We've sent exploration teams in all directions. What about the 2 bunked in room 121C, the deck just below ours? Ethan asked him with a look that Marin knew well. What about those 2? He asked again as he looked across at Marin. My lady, what's going on here? Marin frowned momentarily, but it passed almost before Aaron saw it. Her face calmed once more into a look of determination as she shared a pointed glance with Ethan, measuring how much to actually tell them. Those 2 men are wanted criminals, Aaron. They shouldn't be here. Next time you take on passengers, I suggest checking their credentials closely. But you needn't concern yourself. We'll handle it. Do not, under any circumstances, contact them. As she said this, she pulled her DE-10s and checked the charge, making a show of flipping the selector to stun. Your utilities still in your cabin? Ethan asked as he pulled the parts of his carbine out of his pack and set the upper into place before grabbing a stun dart magazine. Marin grinned and shook her head, pulling her tunic off to expose her utilities underneath. She did the same with her trousers. Buir taught me to always be prepared, she said, softly, her fingers tracing the tags around her neck for a moment as she stuffed the clothing back into the pack she carried. She pulled a bandana from her pocket and tied her hair back before shouldering her pack once more. She could see Aaron watching them momentarily, and she looked across at Ethan. Good. Ethan said as he pulled the charging handle to load a dart and checked his optics. Then let's get going. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us, you have a colony to build and we've got 2 scumbags to catch. Marin grinned a little and shrugged in Aaron's direction. Better that we catch them before they damage equipment or anyone else. With that, she checked the straps on her holsters and turned to follow Ethan. The pockets in her utilities held spare power packs for the DE-10s. There are too many tracks around here for me to pick theirs up, Ethan told her as they started out at a fair clip. You'll have to use your senses first until we get further out. All right, Marin said softly as she walked beside him. Her growth spurt allowed her to keep up with him easily. She took a deep breath and let her eyes fall halfway closed. She could almost navigate the forests of Tanagas blindfolded if she had to. She let out a breath and reached out into the forest. She felt Ethan beside her, his fierce determination and controlled anger burning in his gut. She reached out further and felt the tiny pinpricks of the forest animals. Still further, until she came across that same elusive feeling she'd had of Ethan when she first met him. Her forehead creased in a frown as she focused in. Yup, there were 2 of them. Her eyes opened slowly. 2 clicks northeast of us and moving slowly, almost as if they're looking for something. Okay. Welcome in, Femdizzy. My name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. What that means is that I write and read Star Wars fanfiction, and have been doing so for 25 years. And tonight I'm actually reading one of my stories called Age of Darkness. We're currently on chapter 16. So, welcome in, grab a snack, get cozy, and enjoy the story. That's what we're here for tonight. Are you seriously using that scanner like we're supposed to? Kota asked as he looked at his partner while they walked the trail. Relax, I'm not saving the data. Thanks, Wraith. Give me 1 second. Relax, I'm not saving the data, Darwarda answered as he slowly passed the scanner side to side. But I am checking for any surprises ahead of us. Give me 1 second. Oh. Oh my goodness. Thank you for that stretch. Okay. Okay. That's why I like sneaking up from behind sometimes. They both turned around to see Ethan standing there with his carbine held ready. The girl they knew had tagged along was with him, one hand on a DE-10 at her waist. Howdy, boys, Ethan said as he kept his aim steady. Kind of outside the range they wanted to cover today, isn't it? We have an ad starting in just under 4 minutes. We didn't know we'd gone so far, actually, Kota said passively. We were just going to... You know, Ethan interrupted him, if I didn't know who you 2 really were, I'd about believe that horse Ossic. But picking the name of an old Jedi and using a word from my language isn't a sign of a clever mind when it comes to cover names. Kota and Darwarda shared a look that answered his question, but still attempted to look innocent. Sir, I honestly don't know what you're talking about. Then maybe this will remind you, Marin said, showing the 2 the patch she kept in her equipment vest. It definitely did the trick. The 2 recognized the symbol immediately and split, diving for what it'd cover, and Ethan didn't have enough time to redirect his aim. Damn, if they didn't just fool my aim there, Ethan said as he ran up to where they stood and looked over their tracks. Marin, these 2 are serious. Their boots aren't making much of an impression. Can you track them? Like you have to ask? Good, Ethan said as he ejected the magazine of stun darts from his carbine. He then removed the upper part of the weapon and placed it in his pack before pulling a different upper that fit into the lower half, mainly the stock and trigger assembly. A blaster assembly? Marin asked as she watched him assemble the weapon again. Who taught you the true meaning of being prepared? Buir, of course. I taught him, Ethan said as he pulled out a power cell the same size as the Standard magazine and slammed it into place before pulling the charging handle. Now, we hunt for real. Marin and Ethan moved off into the dimness of the trees, guided by Marin's sense of their quarry in the force. She knew Talon's marines were nearby, but paid them no mind, intent to stay on her quarry. The two made careful progress as they crept closer to the two Kirat ahead of them. Marin communicated with Ethan with a series of hand signals that she planned to take to the trees. She could tell that they were getting close. The next instant, she vanished soundlessly into the branches of the trees above them, skulking along the branch before she leaped to the next one. She was crouched on the limb, looking down at the forest floor, and then she saw it. A flash of movement. One of the Kirat was slinking through the underbrush and doing a decent job of it. But she was better. She'd grown up in this forest. She felt Ethan close by, almost directly beneath her, and looked down at him for a moment as she carefully slid her DE-10 from its holster. Come on, boys, Ethan said as he tracked along the path that he'd seen some movement on, firing a few shots further along the trail, and looked to see if there would be any reaction. You could at least make us work up a sweat here. He knew he was half exaggerating his statement, but he could hear faint footsteps and kept up at a modest pace, breaking into a run as he got a bearing. Occasionally, he stopped and sent a few more shots downrange to herd them closer. Marin crouched on a tree branch above, a few meters down the trail. She could feel the two moving through the underbrush. Her trigger finger twitched in anticipation as she laid her finger along the trigger guard and sighted along the barrel. There! She saw a flicker of movement. She squinted, reaching out with the force as she tightened her finger on the trigger. A bolt of light leaped from the emitter and zipped through the trees. She heard the muttered curse and a muffled thump as her target fell to the forest floor, pain radiating from him in the force. I'm going to stop there because we're about to be in an ad. I will be right back. Go get a drink or a snack. Be right back, guys. Alright. And we're back. Apologize for weird camera angles. I had to swap cameras midstream, had to restart stream. It's been a bit scuffed today. For anybody that just came in, welcome readers. My name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. What that means is that I write and read my own Star Wars fanfiction and have been doing so for the last 25 years. Currently this evening we are reading a story called Age of Darkness, and we are on chapter 16. And I hope you guys enjoy the story. Sit back, get comfy, grab a snack, grab a drink, and enjoy. Sorry. Ethan stopped at the sound of the blaster firing and looked towards Marin to get a bearing. She signaled to him, pointing to her eyes with 2 fingers and then off to her left, tapping her ear. Listen for them, was her message. She could still hear the faint rustling and hissed curses as she crept in the indicated direction. Ethan nodded, motioned to where he had been following the second, and continued down the same line. The woods were getting denser, so he used his left hand on the carbine to sling it over his shoulder. He then pulled his blaster pistol with his right and brought his left fiber blade in hand up to the grip as he kept a steady pace after the second. Decently enough, in spite of all the scuff. Yeah. It's been a little crazy. Marin kept track of him in the force, scanning with her eyes and senses as she closed in on the first. She knew Talon's Marines were about, but so far they'd left the hunt to the 2 Mandalorians. They probably want to see how we do, Marin thought momentarily with a grin as she palmed one of her knives. He was close. They tried to meet back up for a moment, quietly. Both of them were panting from the sudden exertion and evasion they were both doing. Damn that kid, Coda said as he checked his leg that Marin's shot had grazed. How much further do we have to go? Just over the next rise, Darwider told him as he looked around. Come on, quietly. That's okay, Foxy, take your time. Ethan paused from the lack of sound and checked around him to see if he might have missed something before he looked towards Marin again. Marin stopped and let her eyes drift close as she searched in the forest. They were close indeed. She frowned. They'd gotten back together. She pointed to the left again and down, meaning that they were crouching, and then signaled that she knew that there was a small hill nearby. Could they corner the 2 before they made it to the break in the trees? Ethan thought about it and motioned for her to stretch her senses so that she could see if she could sense the waiting Marines. She held up a finger and crouched, reaching out again before she nodded and pointed to several positions around their location without a word. He nodded and mouthed the words, "Drive them," to her before walking slowly along the line she had pointed out for the 2's current path. With a nod, she rose slightly from her crouch amid the leaves and moved off at an angle to Ethan, looping around behind their hiding spot. Over the years, and with Andrea's training, she'd gotten better at hiding herself in the Force and projecting, as she had done during the training with Ethan so long ago. She breathed out and crouched under the low-hanging branches of a tree, reaching out in force once more. In her mind, she saw the 2 men crouching in the underbrush a few dozen meters away. She projected an image of herself crouching outward, placing it between the 2 Kirtzad and Ethan. She made it stand up, ensuring that they would see her as she moved off. They're coming in again, Kota said as he heard footsteps moving towards them. Come on, we've got to the next ridge, Darwider said as he stayed low and started to move at a moderate speed, doing his best to keep low and quiet as they headed towards the top of the ridge. Once they arrived, he pulled his macros and scanned the next area in front of them. If we can keep it up just a bit longer, he told Kota as they started down the hill, we should be free and clear. I wouldn't count on that, they heard from in front of them. The voice caught them off guard, as did the dozen-plus figures that emerged from the brush in front of them. All of them were pointing blaster carbines at the pair as Ethan and Marin reached the top of the ridge from the other side. Let us do all the flushing, huh? Ethan asked with a grin as he holstered his pistol and blade, bringing his carbine back into play. Marin smirked slightly and shook her head, slipping her knife back into its sheath as she palmed her lightsaber. She knew better than to underestimate these two after the chase they'd given. Okay. It is 9 o'clock. I know I said I was going to read chapter 17, but I may have to actually stop at the end of 16 due to time. Unless you guys really think that I should read 17. So I really wanted to read all the way to 17, but it's already 9 o'clock, so that's the thing. Kota woke up slowly and tried to blink. His respect for his partner was starting to wane as he decided he would try to make a move earlier. It earned them both a stun bolt between the shoulder blades, and he was now coming around. As he tried to move, he found he was bound to a rather good-sized tree. I know. I knew we have to leave for work. Ah, you're waking up, Ethan said as he walked over and knelt. That's good. I don't have to do it for you. Kota looked up to his captor and took in the situation around him. The Marines had set up an encampment right where they had been captured. Judging by the number of hot coals already there, he could see the sign of a fire that had been burning for quite a while. It told him that he had been out for several hours, at the very least. But what caught his attention was a flat rock sitting there with several rods on it and a knife or two, with their tips in the coals of the fire. Ethan followed his gaze to the campfire. Oh yeah, I see what's got your attention now, he said, as he looked back to Kota. I figured I'd have some things ready just in case you two thought about giving me a hard time. Marin watched the exchange from a few feet away as she sharpened her knives. She knew that they had to get information from the Kirtzad, but could it be done without walking in darkness? She knew Etika was no Jeti, but her training and her oath to Master Card bound her that she would never walk the path of darkness again. But could she keep that promise? She could feel the anger simmering inside as her gaze settled on Kota momentarily before returning to her task at hand. And don't worry about your friend, either, Ethan told him as he noticed that he was still looking around. With the serum I use in my trank rounds, he'll be out for several more hours. Now, Ethan said without preamble as he drew a knife from his belt, I need you focused. He jammed the knife downward faster than Kota could react, and the Kirtzad yelled as the blade sank into his thigh. Are you focused now? Ethan asked, holding the man's hair tightly. Kota gritted his teeth and breathed hard from the pain of the strike, his gaze burning into Ethan's. Good. You're focused and handling it pretty well. You start answering me straight and you won't have to deal with much more like that. Kota spat a rather strong Mando'a curse, clenching his teeth against the pain. Do you really think we'd give ourselves up that easily? Shab, Haruir was an easier kill. He directed his words to Ethan, but his gaze tracked to Marin. She stiffened, the fingers that clutched her knife closing firmly around the hilt as she began to rise to her feet. Ethan took it personally, twisting the knife and making him scream before he backfisted Kota across the face hard enough to send several teeth flying in one direction. It dazed him momentarily before Ethan grabbed his hair and pulled his head back. I don't expect you to, Naish, Ethan told him with gritted teeth. But know this. You chose the hard way, and I promise that you'll tell me what you know and then beg for death when I'm done. I'm no Jatize, and I won't have any mercy on you until I have what you know. Kota sneered. You'll try. His words were slurred slightly due to the missing teeth and the blood pooling in his mouth. Still, his gaze tracked once more to Marin. She'd stepped towards the two, her grip firm on the hilt of her knife. She could sense the Marines spread out in the perimeter, guarding while the two Mandalorians did what they had to. But she could feel the little spikes of satisfaction with every blow they heard Ethan land. I believe that the Jatize have a saying from one of their Grand Masters that is so fitting, Ethan said with a grin of his own. There is no try. He yanked the knife out of Kota's thigh, the serrated edge doing even more damage, and it made Kota yell, but he screamed even louder as Ethan buried the blade in his other leg. Ethan smacked him across the face and pulled his head back once more. Now, for starters, who sent you? I know you're following Duran's orders, but who set this up? Kota hissed in pain, shaking his head firmly. Nesh, I won't tell. Ethan Ethan made a face of mock disappointment and pulled the knife out of Kota's thigh, ignoring the scream of pain as he walked over to the campfire. He wiped the blade off with an old piece of cloth before he resheathed it and looked down at one of the other tools on the rock next to the fire. He picked up a small blade and looked over the first few centimeters of it, hot enough to where the metal was almost white in a few places before walking over to where Kota was bound. He knelt, still inspecting the knife's edge before looking across at the prisoner. This is your last chance. It's only going to get worse from here. Kota swallowed, his pain-filled gaze finding Ethan's momentarily. Go to Daryam, he hissed, his gaze wandering to where Marin was again. Ethan glanced at Marin and then Kota and shook his head. So be it. Darwerda was slowly starting to wake, but was struggling. His head felt like he'd been gone several rounds with a wampa and a fist-only bout. He slowly opened his eyes and almost retched in surprise at seeing what remained of Kota across from him. You're awake, he heard from behind him as he saw Ethan walk up from his right and kneel beside him. The trank serum lasted a bit longer than I thought it would. I had a chance to clean up the area and some of my tools before you woke up. Darwerda swallowed. He dared not even look over at what remained of Kota. At the mention of tools, his gaze slid toward the fire. He saw the young girl there, busy sharpening her knives. Ethan followed his gaze and looked back at him to judge his reaction. I know Darwerda isn't your real name, he said as he sat down. I'd like to know your real one. The man's gaze snapped back to Ethan. What does it matter to you? His voice was rough, and it sounded faintly sick. Privately, he wondered why the girl was even with him. She had not participated in any of the questioning as far as he was aware. Marin sighed, only half listening to Ethan's questions as he sharpened his knives. Part of her wanted to participate, but she was worried about what she might do if she did. I think a person has a right to know the real name of those he has to fight against, Ethan said, matter-of-factly. And you and I are on opposite sides of this fight. And your leader made this personal for myself and my charge here when her father, my friend, was killed. Did you know about that? Darwerda's eyes widened and his gaze slid towards Marin again. I did not, he said quietly. I followed orders. They didn't tell us why. I can understand that, Ethan said. You're a soldier in that respect, Darwerda. We know you probably did recon well in Katan's home system. I know that Duran probably ordered it. Who gave him the order? Darwerda sighed. I'm not sure. Duran never really said. I do know he was always reporting to someone. They were obviously paying very well. He shifted slightly, testing his bonds. The Hutts would have no interest in Durza, but the Imps would. He did some work for them, if I recall. Ethan looked up at the statement and pinned him with a hard gaze. I don't know where you might have heard that, but I'll tell you that it is a lie. Jarius Durza was no friend of the Empire. He leaned forward. I know you might have thought that to be true because of what you heard, so there would be no point in thinking that you're lying, but I want to be very clear about something. You take a good look at your friend. Darwerda's gaze slid sideways, and he glanced towards the remains of Kota's body before looking back to Ethan and nodding curtly. You've made your point. He frowned. If that's true, is it perhaps possible that the Imps were interested in Durza because he was thwarting their efforts at expansion? His tone was wary, for he'd worked a few of those missions himself and been paid well. He'd had no idea until the last couple. Ethan nodded and looked towards Kota again. I don't know what you're thinking about what happened to him. I offered him many times to tell me the truth, and he refused each time. And now, how much recon work was done? Darwarda swallowed, his gaze sliding towards Marin for a moment. We did, well, a lot. It wasn't hard to slip away from the main survey party. Marin looked up as she felt Darwarda's gaze rest on her. She rose from where she sat near the fire, keeping her knife handy as she crossed the leaf-strewn ground. As she reached them, she glanced at Ethan. Did you already know, or did you discover the location of the house? He looked up at her momentarily, noticing her eyes and the storm behind them, and he sighed. House? We never were told anything about a house. A T-47 was waiting for us somewhere north of here. For what? Ethan asked him. Darwarda sighed again. The line was already crossed. We were to meet with a ship at the system's outer edge, an Imperial Special Recon vessel. Marin tensed. What would the Shabla Imperials want with us? She fixed Darwarda with a searching look as she reached out to touch his mind in the Force. What had you been told to look for? He closed his eyes momentarily, feeling a need to come clean now. Rig the scanners of the ship we were on to record all data while traveling through Katan's systems to data cards. We were to transmit all the data to the Imperials at the rendezvous. Ethan traded a look with Marin, wondering if she was using any of her Force abilities before he looked back to Darwarda. Sorry. What ships are the Imperials using? We don't know. They told us to wait at the northern edge of the system. Marika, Ethan said as he got up and motioned for her to come over to the side with him. Marin's eyes widened and she rose to her feet, following as he walked off a few meters. Ethan? Taylor needs to know this so he can alert the command, he told her quietly so they wouldn't be overheard. Stay with him until I get back. Do I need to act like Andrea and remind you to mind your feelings? Marin's mouth fell open in surprise. Are you sure you don't want me to go instead? He gave her a long look. Can you not keep yourself in check around him after 3 years? Marin opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it and merely nodded. Alec, I can, was her quiet response. Anything you want me to do while you're gone? If you can, see if there is any more information he might have. He then looked at Darwarda. But I want you to be careful. I don't want you crossing the line here. Oops, give me 1 second. Okay. I don't want you crossing the line here, Marika. I lost Jarius. I don't want to lose you to something worse. Marin swallowed hard and nodded. I'll do my best, she answered quietly, reaching to the Force for calm as she'd been taught so long ago. All right, I'll be back in a few minutes. He looked to Darwarda again and then walked off to speak with Talon. As Ethan left, Marin settled to the ground a few feet from Darwarda. She took a deep breath to settle her nerves. He looked at her momentarily and then looked to the ground before finally saying something. I'd heard about Galan. I didn't really agree with it, but that was before Duran took over all of Kirtzad. Her gaze snapped upwards. What do you know of Galan? And what do you mean, before he took control? Word was that he'd wanted to strike out on his own, starting with a base on Galan. He got howled down by our leader. Darwarda said before sighing. 1.5 years ago, he took over. She sucked in a breath, her fingers absently tracing the hilt of the lightsaber that rested on her thigh. What happened then? She looked at him intently and nudged him a little in the Force. If you tell me, it will help you. He looked at the lightsaber and then up at her face. He's been ruthless, making deals and arrangements that normally wouldn't have been made, especially with outsiders. He's lost numbers. Others in Kirtzad haven't agreed with him openly and left before he could retaliate. Marin nodded. The Weir told me once about their recruitment methods. She glanced down at her hands. Is it normal for people who refuse to join Kirtzad to be hunted? He looked up at the question. Only his. Was there anything specific you were told to look for during your survey? Of Catan? Or here? Both, but here specifically. Set the scanner to record everything while we're here in Catan's home system, he told her. They didn't say anything about this place, just that the ship was going to be north of the landing site. She frowned. Why would the Imperials want information on Catan? And then it hit her like a sucker punch to the stomach. They wanted Catan. They remain the same, he said quietly. It seems like the imps want it all now as they did before. She frowned. Catan's location would have no strategic advantage for them. It's too far from the core. He looked over at her. How much history do you know, young one? That got her attention. As far as the Empire is concerned, not much, I'm afraid. They controlled most of the galaxy for a long time, Darwarda told her. The only area they didn't have a solid hold on was the Outer Rim. Even wiped out almost all of the Detize in the beginning. Hi, Lord. Welcome in. Her fingers closed involuntarily around the hilt of the lightsaber on her belt. They wanted total control. Why? Surely such an iron grip couldn't bring peace. Of course not, he said. This galaxy hasn't seen complete peace for eons. There's always going to be conflict. He sighed at that last comment. She frowned. Why did you join Kirtzad if you felt this way? I was young and foolish then, he said as he made a personal decision. And I had contemplated the same decisions those others have made. He looked at Koda's body again and then back to Marin. Is my pack still here? It is, she answered, frowning. He nodded softly and made his final decision. I'm getting too old for all of this. The data cards are in my pack. I'll take my imprisonment with the Katani, and then I want to go my own way. I'll pass that along. She gazed at him for a long moment. What's to keep Joran from hunting you down like he did my father? He smiled softly. I still have friends among those that left. He hasn't found them. And he won't find me, especially if you and your friend are on his trail. She raised a curious eyebrow. My other gift of repentance, he said. Last word was that he was basing out of Iriadu. She nodded and rose to go retrieve the data cards from his pack. She then took them safely into one of her belt pouches before returning. As she settled to the ground again, she reached out briefly in the Force. Edgar should be back soon, she hoped. Darwarda sighed and relaxed against the tree, closing his eyes. Luck be with you in the hunt, Durza. She frowned and moved a few steps closer. How is it that you know of me, anyway? He looked back at her, curious. Jarius was known to us. There have been stories that he'd taken in a daughter. Seeing your reaction to what your mentor and I have said, I can only assume that you are her. He sighed again. As I told you, I disagreed with what happened to him. Marin's gaze fell to the leaf-strewn ground for a moment. When his family was killed, he went on a rampage. I was very close to doing the same when I found out he'd been murdered. I know of his rampage, Darwarda said as he looked away. I'm glad that you didn't follow that same path. She smiled briefly. I wanted to, but my mentor was able to stop me. I wanted to find Joran and kill him. Slowly. She shuddered at the thought. He nodded at this as Ethan came back towards them. So, Ethan said as he looked to Marin and then over to Darwarda, anything else you'd like us to know about? Your charge can fill you in, the Kirtzad said as he looked at Ethan. When the Marines are ready, I will not resist. Ethan looked over to Marin for confirmation. She nodded and outlined briefly what Darwarda had said, passing over the data cards as she did so. He says that Joran is based out of Iriadu. We should be able to find him there. Ethan nodded. We'll ride with the Marines back to Catan, where we can pick up the rest of our gear and the ship before we check it out. I hope the imps will have a surprise waiting for them in a few hours. And that is the end of chapter 16. I'm actually going to stop there because I had some technical issues. So, didn't get as much reading in as I wanted to. But I appreciate everybody who came in tonight and hung out. I hope you enjoyed the story, even with all of the scuff. And I hope you have an awesome evening and a great finish to your week. Lord, it was good to see you. Foxy, Wraith, Tubba, Ajo, anybody else I may have missed. I appreciate you all for being here. Thank you so much. And I hope you have an awesome night. Thanks, guys.